again. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bill Kavanaugh. I'm the director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology, and we're delighted today to have Father Michael Kirwan with us, who's been a visiting scholar with us, and will be with us for another month?
A few days, actually, yes.
A few days, is that
yes,
all?
leaving Sunday.
Oh, my goodness. Okay. Michael is a man of the world, a true Jesuit, director of studies at Heythrop College in London, expert in Girard, has written several books on the work of René Girard, who writes on religion and violence and related themes, and Michael is considered one of the kind of major figures in this field in the question of theology and Girard studies. Will you be in Australia in
I hope to be in Australia, yeah.
Okay, good. So we keep running into each other
yeah.
all kinds of here and there. But today Michael is going to talk to us about a project that he's engaged in, kind of looking at the Jesuits as a kind of Jesuit style in contemporary global theology. I'll leave everybody has the full description of many of Michael's accomplishments here in front of them. I won't read it through, but just ask you to join me in welcoming Father Michael Kirwan.
Thank you very much indeed. Those very kind words of welcome. I'm at the beginning of a period of sabbatical leave, which is going to take in Chicago and hopefully later in the summer, Philippines and Australia as well, and then a stint back in Europe for about 6 weeks in the middle of that. So I'm just getting into gear at the moment, beginning to think about the kind of things I want to work on and think about, and I'm very much appreciative of the chance to widen the lens a little bit by coming to Chicago, spending a little bit of time at the centre, and I want to thank particularly Bill, but also Karen, Francis, Anna, and Stan, and Michael's also here. People who are involved, making me feel so very welcome and helping me to kind of begin to formulate some of the ideas for what Bill's mentioned is a kind of amorphous project at the moment, trying just to think a little bit globally. I'm quite sure whether I'm a man of the world as described, but at least to begin to think of what that might imply to be a kind of theologian with this kind of global perspective. And this has been the place to do that. And I'd also like to thank my college in London, Heythrop College, which has enabled me to be here, and the Jesuits who've enabled me to come, and my Jesuit colleagues in Loyola, which is where I'm staying, but actually doing my thinking and working at the centre here. So, during the course of reflecting upon this, I've given a rather grand title to what I'm going to talk about: Jesuit Planet, Pretension to a Global Theology. So some pretensions that I'm going to put out there, and perhaps they'll be whittled down to size in the course of our discussion. That is the Jesuit planet that I will be referring to. It's familiar to all of us. It's the only one we've got.
Is it?
Sorry?
Earth, is it?
That is indeed Earth, and I'm glad to say that Africa is very central in that particular slide. So that's what we're trying to make sense of. That's the planet that I'm describing as amenable to reflections upon Jesuit style theology. When I put Jesuit planet in the search engine to see whether anyone had picked that up, I did come across something interesting, which well, it may be of interest. I haven't fully got the story, but apparently there's a planet which is moving towards the Earth, and this represents a dangerous situation, either because it's going to crash into us, or because there's alien life forms been discovered on it, and we've made contact with them, but the whole thing is highly secret, and the Vatican Observatory know about it, but very few other people do. And apparently there's a Jesuit who leaked some information about this, and so if you put Jesuit footage into your search engine, this is what's going to come up. And apparently the Jesuits are behind the Roswell alien conspiracy as well. I don't know why is it always us? Why is it the Jesuits? Why don't the Dominicans come in for this stuff? Or even the Vincentians? But anyway, there's the footage. But that's not the planet we'll talk about today. This is where we'll try and pitch our reflections in terms of what a global style, a global way of thinking about Catholicism and Christianity might be about. And in the process, I'll be reflecting a little bit, or echoing some of the things that I've heard in the events of the last few weeks here at the centre, and the kind of discussions that have been going on here. So hopefully that will be generating a discussion as well. Actually, let's go back to that. There's a point in the exercise, the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, where he asks us to take this kind of global view, but to imagine the world from the perspective of the Trinity. And he imagines the three persons of the Trinity looking down on the earth. And what do they see? They see men and women arguing and fighting, swearing at one another, and generally behaving in such a way as is taking them to their eternal damnation. They are lost, and the person of the Trinity are looking down and saying, one of us is going to have to go down there and sort them out, more or less. And the second person of the Trinity says, I will go. And the meditation, which is the meditation of the Incarnation, then does a kind of zoom in. It's a bit like Google Earth. Suddenly you're in a little house in Nazareth, and the angel is appearing to Mary and saying, we want you to do this. So that's the global vision, if you like, right at the heart of the spiritual exercises of Ignatius. And it's radically global and then radically local in quick succession. And that transition is interesting also when you look at the early history of the Jesuits, because one of the earliest ambitions that Ignatius had for this group of men that he gathered around him was that they would work in the Holy Land. Ignatius was obsessed with the land where this event took place. Probably on this map, it's just on the top. Probably you could just get Nazareth on the very top of this picture of the globe there. But that, for Ignatius, was the obsession. The land where Jesus lived and walked and taught was where he wanted to be. And his ambition for the Jesuits was, as a group of men, to work and minister there. And if that doesn't work out, the idea was that he would present himself and these men to the Holy Father. They would go to Rome, they'd present themselves to the Pope and say, do with us what you will. Send us wherever the greatest need is. The idea being that because the Pope has this wider view, he would know where the priorities are, and then he could mission accordingly. So at the beginnings of the Jesuit story is this radical shift of gear from an understanding of the Jesuit thing as a very localized project to one that had global implications and global dimensions. We want to come back to that to determine what kind of imagination is this that can move between those two so dramatically. So if you want to think of it in terms of geography, that's the view that Ignatius had to begin with, and that's the Mappa Mundi on the left, the simplified version on the right, which shows how the world is understood from a medieval mindset. We've got Jerusalem bang in the centre, Eden is at the top of the globe there, and Europe, Africa and Asia, of course no America at this stage, and certainly no Philippines or anything like that. This map is a map from 1490, which is the year before Ignatius was born. As you can see, already things are becoming a bit more complex, not centred on Jerusalem anymore, but the world as we understand it is beginning to take shape. They haven't quite got Africa right, but the rest of it is beginning to look familiar to us. Still no America, of course. And then a century later, that's what is coming into view. The globe, the world in which the earliest Jesuits find themselves ministering and find themselves being taken up to most of the parts of the globe that are represented on that map. But to see both, or all three, if you like, of those maps representing something of the Jesuit psyche, something of the Jesuit vision, the theatre of operations. So, as I say, in the autobiography of Ignatius, he has this declaration that they want to work in the Holy Land. The SJ, which we know and love it, is Plan B. Going to Rome, because the Holy Land project fell through, it's going to Rome and offering themselves for a global mission under the direction of the Holy Father. Moving to the last century and to one of the main theological figures of the 20th century, Karl Rahner, I'd just like to dwell upon a particular account that he has of something in relation to what we're looking at, and to see how this plays out. Some of you may well be familiar with this idea of the three epochs of the church. This is an article he wrote, or an address he gave in 1979, and he invites us to consider the theological significance of the Second Vatican Council. How are we to understand it theologically? And he proposes that there are, again theologically speaking, three great eras, three great epochs of the church. To begin with, the church starts off from a Jewish matrix. It starts off as a movement within Judaism, very much shaped by the aspirations and the hopes of the Jewish religious imagination. And up until about 50 years of its existence, up to the 1850s, when we have this account in the New Testament of the Council of Jerusalem, where a decision has to be made as to whether it will continue to work within this Jewish matrix, or whether that is giving birth to something which is much more wide, much more inclusive. And of course the discussion between Jews and Gentiles is something that is written through on every page of the New Testament. It's there throughout Paul's writings, it's there through the Acts of the Apostles and so on. And the council at which the decision is made, which is recorded in the Acts of the Apostles, is the crucial rupture, according to Rahner, within which the church moves from its Jewish origins supposedly into a more universal one, but in fact, the second phase, from AD 50 Common Era, through to the 20th century, you actually have a church that is shaped by its Mediterranean, Hellenistic, Roman heritage. So rather than becoming a global church or a world church, it actually becomes a European church, which is then exported out in different ways during the periods of colonialism and so on. And it's only with the Second Vatican Council that we have the beginnings of a truly world church coming into view. That for the first time, we have a church that is represented by clergy from indigenous populations. We have real efforts to work towards enculturation of liturgy and so on. So it's only with the post-conciliar period, this third phase that we moved into, that the church truly becomes a world church. I'll just dwell for a moment on the audacity of this scheme. If you're asked to divide the church up historically into different periods, we'd think of maybe the key ones as to do with perhaps Constantine. We might think of medieval church, with the Reformation or the Schism. But for Rahner, the key theological ruptures are the ones that happen from us becoming a Jewish to a Gentile church, and from a Gentile European church to a genuinely global one. So there is an analogy between this first break and the one that we are experiencing now. an extraordinarily kind of audacious description, but it highlights the significance of the period of the church's life that we are living in right now. And what is interesting about that article is to see I think a bit of a contrast, if you like, between the extraordinary breadth of the description he gives, and he doesn't really follow through on the possible implications of this. So he wants, what does it mean for us to be genuinely a world church? Does this mean that, for example, marriage customs, which essentially operate out of a kind of European mindset, are still applicable for particular racial, particular ethnic groups elsewhere? Can we use rice wine in the Eucharist? That kind of, he doesn't actually go into a lot of detail, but the implications of the scheme that he's setting out here, I think, are considerable. And in a sense, we are just getting to grips with those. And if you think of the trauma that was involved for the early church, which required what Rana calls the Pauline boldness, it took a figure like St. Paul to really insist upon the break that was necessary. If you think of that kind of upheaval that was required, that's the kind of upheaval that we are undergoing now, and it is the work of the Spirit. It is the Spirit that is at work in that kind of upheaval, but requiring of us a similar kind of courage, similar kind of boldness. All of this, of course, has implications for people like myself as a kind of first world theologian. What's being called of me in terms of kind of standing back? What kind of kenosis, when I use, if you want to kind of use a kind of theological term, this kind of non-self-assertion that requires the voices of the global south to genuinely become the voices of the church. And of course that's what concerns the centre here as well. How do we truly enable this world church to come into being in a way that is authentic? But that's very challenging for those who's working out of particular paradigms that somehow need to be changed or expanded or transformed. Let's just zip around and look at one or two of these places. Incidentally, I want to notice that this talk is actually being mapped out according to the structure of an Ignatian meditation. So Ignatius, at the beginning of the meditations, this is what I want. And then he has a number of preambles. And then he says, take a look. Take a look at the scene you want to pray about. Picture it. Listen to what people say. Listen to what they do and so on. So everything that we've set up to now is kind of preambles, point 1, point 2, point 3. And then just take a moment to look at some of the aspects of the world church that is coming into being. And obviously this is ridiculously schematic. I have to apologise for undertaking what's really very much a whistle-stop tour of one or two places. But this is what Jesuits are up to, 16th, 17th century. These are the kind of very important missionary endeavours, but they would illustrate what Rana was saying about this second epoch of the church, which is basically a European church engaging with the rest of the world, but essentially exporting European Christianity. And although we're very proud of what men like Tom Stevens, Robert de Nobili, and Sir Francis Xavier were doing, the fact is that there's a sense there of a kind of export license that they were wielding. And that, of course, is what needs to be thought. The Calcutta Jesuit School of Indology in the early part of the 20th century, very fine scholars from Europe, from Belgium mainly, being sent out to India to look for ways of dialoguing with Hinduism in particular. And the intention, very noble, what we wish to do is to help India to know and understand Jesus. We've no intention to put out the existing lights. Rather, we should try to show that the best thought of the East is a bud that, fully expanded, blossoms into Christian thought. That's the journal that was produced by the Centre, Light of the East. That's a quotation from 1922. One of the figures most associated with this, Pierre Johans, and perhaps he overstates the case a little bit here. He says, if the Vedanta philosophers only bring their several positive statements into harmony, they will turn disconnected doctrines into a system, and that system will be Thomism, or something akin to Thomism. In the wake of St. Paul, we believe we may speak not only the unknown God of the Greeks, but also the hidden Christ of Hinduism. Hidden, unknown, and yet present and at work, because he is not far from any one of us. Might be more at home with the second part of that, which is scripturally based, than the first part. The first part basically saying, look, if you Asians could just systematize your thought a little bit better, you'd end up with the Summa Theologica. So maybe that's putting it a bit strong. But recognizing the affinities between sacred texts from India and, of course, the Gospels. Aloysius Pieris, the Jesuit from Sri Lanka, best known for writing The Asian Theology of Liberation in the late 80s, offering something of a panoramic view of Christianity across the many varied contexts of Asia. Asia simultaneously religious and poor, and recognizing the limitations of various attempts to bring Christ to Asia, to the extent that he does ask the question, is there a place, is there room for Christ in Asia alongside these other great religious traditions? Engaging with a culture which is both poor and deeply religious, and he recognised the limitations of the efforts up to that point, which have been basically Euro-ecclesiastical, but also the non-Western Christ of scholars. There's been a kind of disembodied Christ that has been preached. A head without a body. There's been scholars exploring the similarities between Hindu scriptures and St. Thomas, or whatever it is. And that level of discourse, there are plenty of that, but there hasn't been an incarnation of Christ in Asia. And the themes that he picks up on, the broken body of the Indian Christ, the Dalit theology from India, the harm-ridden body of Christ, Korean Minjung theology, and he gives other examples, feminist interpretations of Asian womanhood. The third world Christ represented the third worldliness of Asia. And he'd be one of those to say the figures, the best known figures for a particular style of renewed engagement. So, to the answer, does Christ have a place? Yes, he does, but the reservations, critical of the Gnostic Christ of high caste elites, Orientalists and Ashramites. And there's also resistance to the Marxist-inspired liberation theology that comes from Latin America. That's seen as being inappropriate in most cases. Is there a distinction to be made, such as Raymond Panica makes, between Christendom, civilization, in this case the European synthesis of a social order which is very much identified with European culture and so on. Do we distinguish that from Christianity as a religion? And is that in turn to be distinguished from Christianness, an orientation, Christic principle that can be found among Hindus, among Muslims, acknowledging a Christic orientation without necessarily having to become members of the church. So different implications there, certainly for what the church is and how one belongs and how one commits to Christ, but different ways of announcing this presence of Christ in Asia. He has a place in Asia, he's already there among the poor. I'm just very briefly going to mention, just really obviously flag up the more recent tradition of comparative theology, which has been going largely centered at Boston College. Once again, Jesuits very much involved in that, involving a much more painstaking conversation between religious texts and traditions, primarily between Christianity and Hinduism and Buddhism. But a task which is seen to be seem to require an enormous amount of commitment, an enormous amount of time, rather than simply saying, well, if you just look properly, you'd see that your scriptures are just like ours, or whatever. Recognition that this kind of project, if it's to take the other religious tradition seriously, does need to invest time in understanding it and arriving at a point of real dialogue. And one of the important aspects of comparative theology is that the different traditions can genuinely enrich each other if that kind of endeavour can be carried out. Just to kind of, as I say, flag that up, no time to talk about it more than simply to mention it, but it's an example of where we've come to, if you like, from these earlier attempts to bring Christ to Asia, with all the kind of inspiring examples of heroism and so on, but also limitations. I'm going to mention just two books which I've come across recently, which raised some of the questions. Simon Chan was here a few weeks ago. He's at the conference on Pentecostalism, which was my first experience of the centre, and his book, Grassroots Asian Theology, puts some, I think, very important questions to the kind of theology that's been going on, looking at the notion of Christ in Asia, answering that question. That's one text. His book is called Grassroots Asian Theology, and a book that was handed to me by a student at my college from the Philippines. He said, "Oh, you should read this," when he heard that I was coming to the Philippines. And this is from Theological de la Cruz, the Theodula of the Salubong. Theodula is Tagalog for theodrama, and the Salubong is a ceremony that we'll look at a little bit later on, associated with Easter celebrations. It's an example of very much grassroots, popular religiosity, and it is open to particular theological interpretation, which Rafael de la Cruz gives that. And I want to kind of just share a little bit about what's been resonating with me from these two authors. First of all, Chan is offering a critique of some of the ways in which theology hasn't really come to grips with the particular realities of Asia, and in particular Western theology has tended to flatten out or misrepresent many of the things that are going on. He's coming at this as a Pentecostalist, but somebody who is very much steeped in systematic theology. And I think his book, although I wouldn't agree with everything that's there, is important in terms of presenting a kind of seriously scholarly attempt to try and bring some of the problems into view. In particular, an overemphasis on Christology, and not enough emphasis on how Christology is to be related to pneumatology, to the role of the Holy Spirit. Like you can see how that comes from a Pentecostalist critique that we have under thought, or we still need to find out ways of speaking of the Spirit of Christ as well as Christ himself. And a concern that, once again, the theology that we do when we speak about Asia has been a rather heady kind of affair, has not been sufficiently rooted or attentive to grassroots. He has severe reservations about things like contextual theology, because the danger is that context can end up shaping our theology and taking over from the gospel. And so he's got, I think, some important little warning signs about how Western scholarship in particular can be not sufficiently critical of what's going on. and in particular looking to incorporate this kind of grassroots perspective. There's an awful lot going on at the level of popular religiosity and stuff that Western scholars generally aren't looking out for and tend to ignore. That's something I want to come back to, both from Chan and from De La Cruz, with the importance of grassroots and some of the questions perhaps around that. An interesting model which Chan refers to but doesn't develop is the notion of drama, once again, the drama of doctrine, which maybe we can think of the relationships between our traditions and our scriptures and our ecclesial practices as a kind of drama. And if you think of the scriptures as a script for a play, how those get played out, how those get acted out, would be what the church does in its doctrine and its pastoral practices, in its liturgy. So scriptures are the kind of script play. Holy Spirit is the director, and everything that the church is doing is the carrying out of the play. I think he draws on Kevin Van Hooser for this image of the drama as a way of bringing together some of those old disputes around sola scriptura, tradition, and so on. How are they best to be related? And that seems to be an important suggestion, which again he doesn't follow up in the book, but seems to me to be worth thinking about. De La Cruz does that takes that a step further in his theological drama of encounter. And the encounter in question is the Salubon, which is the festival that takes place at Easter. It is a dramatization of the meeting of the risen Lord with his weeping mother. And there are two versions of the Salubon, as I understand it. There is the Holy Week version, the Stations of the Cross, where Jesus meets his weeping mother on the way to Calvary. But the important one from this perspective is the encounter after the resurrection. And once again, it's interesting that the Jesuits are behind this particular devotion. It's possibly one of the ways in which it found its way to Philippines in the first place. It's one of the meditations in the exercises, once again. The risen Lord meets his mother. Of course he did. You're not going to appear to all these people in Jerusalem and not go and see his mum. So Jesus meets the risen Lord meets the mother, and it's a great dramatic coming together of two processions. One led by the men, carrying the figure of the risen Lord. The other, carried by the women, is the weeping mother of Christ veiled. And it is the joyful encounter. The word Salubong means encounter, as I understand it. Encounter, even a kind of chance encounter, bumping into somebody. But this is obviously a much more significant encounter. A couple of photographs of this. Those are the two statues being brought together. That's the greeting. You can see how this is obviously very powerfully charged as a celebration. And the idea is that an angel descends and lifts the veil off the face of the Virgin Mother. And you have this lovely, delightful picture of the poor little girl looks terrified. She's hanging and she's lifting the veil of the Mother there, so it's a lovely picture. The book that I'm referring to takes the work of Hans von Balthasar and another theologian called Rivera, who are presenting the drama as an important theological instrument. If we can think of what goes on in a drama, what goes on in theatre, we see human beings attempting a certain kind of self-transcendence, trying to go beyond ourselves. If you speak to an actor, and the sense of them reaching out beyond themselves to be somebody else. Carefully used, said von Balthasar, we can use the theodrama as an account, as a kind of image or pattern for what is going on between ourselves and God. And Balthasar puts a lot of work into constructing his theodrama, seeing the events of God's encounter with human beings in dramatic terms, as a kind of encounter between free agents, encounters that are charged with significance. If you were to translate what Balthasar is saying, and other theologians working with this notion of theodrama, if you translate it into very straightforward, familiar terms, I'd say look at what's happening in the Gospel of John. The fourth Gospel would lend itself very much to a kind of dramatic reading. You've got set passages of conversations or arguments which would work very well as drama. And then think about Holy Week. Think about what Catholics do during Holy Week. Think about the different tableaus of Palm Sunday, of Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and then the Easter celebrations itself. There's this scope for thinking of the important events that shape human destiny in dramatic terms as a drama. Now that's what Von Balthasar has done, and here's the main figure behind De la Cruz's exploration of the soluble. There are difficulties with this, which come back to, I think, well, difficulties I should say with Karl Rahner as much as anyone else. I mean, there's something odd going on in Rahner's theology, where the drama takes a funny shape in some ways. For Rahner, for Balthasar rather, the drama isn't at all. The notion of the drama includes human beings' refusal of God. That's part of the dramatic story, that God offers himself and human beings refuse. And that's very Johannine. God loves the world, but the world puts up resistance to God. And that's why the Holy One of God is put to death. So the drama incorporates this literally dramatic clash of independent wills of agents. But one of the difficulties with Balthasar is that this drama is also found within the Godhead. And there's something about the wrath of God which comes very close to penal substitution in Balthasar. The idea that the Son is being punished, that the wrath of God is being poured out upon the Son. And even Mary takes part in that. There's one point in Balthasar where he speaks of Mary willing the nails to be hammered into the Son's hands, because Mary knows at the foot of the cross how necessary the suffering is. And at this point you're thinking, something very odd is going on here. The Salomon is this joyful encounter of the mother who's lost her son and the son's been raised again. So I have reservations about how well Balthasar will allow us to do all of that kind of work that we want to do. Something, as I say, a little bit unhealthy about his stuff, which we can talk about perhaps. Let's zoom across the world and pick up something similar to what we've just been mentioning. Things are happening once again in Latin America. Things have become a point of focus for obvious reasons. I came across this photograph of liberation theologians of the kind of classic generation. And don't ask me to name all of them, I can recognise one or two. And I don't know how many of these are Jesuits. There'd be a fair number, I'd imagine. But that's the kind of generation of theologians who had an enormous impact upon the Church's theology for about 25 years, in the golden age of liberation theology from about 1968 through to the mid-80s, and for good or ill, depending on one's point of view. As I say, an enormous impact, not just in Latin America, but across the globe. And I think we're mostly familiar with the kind of discussions about the limitations of liberation theology, and that's not something we want to get involved in too much just now, but what's ignited the debate in many ways is a particular variation of liberation theology that has emerged from Argentina in the person of the Pope. The Teología del Pueblo, the theology of the people, which is something that's nurtured Jorge Bergoglio as prelate in Buenos Aires. That's the theological tradition that he would claim to come from. and I think it's best seen as one of the possible variants of liberation theology, but one with important differences from those other better-known streams. And let's take a look at just some of the aspects of this, because obviously they're significant for us. Once again, we're back to the importance of popular religiosity, and this is the Tincunaco ceremony in La Rioja in Argentina. The word Tincunaco means encounter. And it represents, once again, an encounter between the boy mayor, El Niño, who's depicted there, and St. Nicholas. And the story goes that in 1593, there was a standoff between the indigenous people and the Spanish government, the Spanish governors, and the standoff was resolved. And as a commemoration of the fact that this argument resolved peaceably and that these sides could coexist, this ceremony was instigated, where you have the boy mayor, El Niño, is representative of Jesus, as I understand it, and at the point of everybody coming, the other side are represented then by St. Nicholas, who represents the Europeans, and there's a point where they all gather in front of the town hall and they all pay homage to the boy Niño, to the boy mayor, as an indication that God is ultimately behind all governments, that God is the true governor, if you like. And big festival takes place around the beginning of the year, and been going for 400 years. Again, suggestions that the Jesuits are the ones who are responsible for perhaps initiating this as a kind of commemoration of good relations. Juan Carlos Scanone, who's one of the prominent theologians behind the theology of the people, points out the significance of the Tincunaco festival. Both the rite and the legend tacitly demand through their symbols a just social peace in which preference is given to the poorest and most oppressed, those who gather beside the Mayor Niño. In addition, the Tincunaco symbolically confess that all political authority comes from God and must be exercised for the common good, with special care for those who are victims of injustice. So he picks on this particular ritual as an example of what the theology of the people is trying to get at. It is a proclamation of the importance of social justice, but without resorting to Marxism, without resorting to sociology or liberal theory. It's embodied ritualistically. There's an awful lot invested in El Pueblo, in the people. People are a political, historic, cultural and symbolic pueblo, in contrast to socioeconomic definitions or classist ideas of the people, identifying the people as the proletariat or the peasantry. There's a distinctively anti-Marxist or non-Marxist point of view. Culture isn't a kind of superstructure on an economic base. Culture is the fundamental category for the theology of El Pueblo. So it is turning to culture in its forms that invests this particular style of theology. And culture here includes elements like the economic, the political, or religious. It is not reducible to any of these. So you can see how it's a version of liberation theology, or allegedly, which takes up most of the important insights, but doesn't have some of those defects or some of those concerns that people have often talked about. Its locales, theological locales, found in the expressions of popular culture, especially religious expressions. There's a place for beauty in this theology. Beauty is a manifestation of God, and therefore culture is a theological place. For Guerra, one of the theologians, incarnation of the word in a particular pueblo, and doing theology is to see, to judge, and to act in the culture. The hermeneutical locale then is El Pueblo, as they are concretely embodied in their popular culture. in all its manifestations. A bit of a warning bell ringing for me at this point. I think, okay, this is all very nice, very interesting. In all its manifestations, let's listen to that warning bell for the next few minutes. In their public, as they are interpreted by those in whom they really see themselves interpreted. So there's an autonomy about the people, a place of theological integrity in terms of popular culture in all its manifestations. Let's see. I mentioned Marian devotion at this point, the noble and guiding role that popular religiosity has played, especially in Marian devotion, which has helped make us more conscious of our common condition as children of God and of our common dignity in His eyes. Just remind ourselves, those who were at the seminar last week on Christian-Muslim dialogue in the Philippines, and Amina Bernardo spoke of Mary as a very interesting point of dialogue for Christian and Muslim women. That Marian groups are making headway in terms of peace education and so on, because somehow Mary embodies those values in a way that people are possibly more suspicious of more overtly Christian themes. So Mary isn't just for the Catholics, not just for the Christians. The warning bell again. Nobody educates El Pueblo. El Pueblo is self-understood. El Pueblo evangelized El Pueblo. So there's no question of the intellectuals coming in and guiding or shaping or manipulating groups from outside. The Pueblo have everything they need in terms of theological education. They're self-understood. They evangelize themselves. The self-understanding and the sapiential wisdom of the people is expressed through popular culture and through popular spirituality. Expressions of popular piety, and you see how this is coming into the central teachings of the church. These are quotations from Evangelii Gaudium. Expressions of popular piety have much to teach us. For those who are capable of reading them, they are locus theologicus, which demands our attention, especially when we're looking to the new evangelization. The poor have much to teach us. They share in the sensus fidei, but in their difficulties they know the suffering of Christ. We need to let ourselves be evangelized by them. Challenging rules. But that warning bell hasn't gone away. I just want to get on our magic carpet once again. Let's just come back to Europe for a little while. Just to pick out one or two examples. I thought let's pick the negative examples from Europe, so it doesn't look as if I'm being overcritical of theologies of the South. That's Innsbruck, which is in Austria. It's the place where Karl Rahner is buried. It's an important centre of theological reflection. Not far from Innsbruck is a town called Rinn. And Rinn is famous and notorious for an event that happened in 1642. This was the alleged ritual murder of Andrew Oechsner. The murder itself took place at Judenstein. He himself was from the town of Rinn. And there's a blood libel cult attached to this figure. In other words, the accusation is that he was kidnapped by Jews and his blood was used for anti-Christian rituals. There's an image of this in the church, which was only removed in 1994. The image is there on the right of the child being slain by the Jewish peddlers who had allegedly kidnapped him. They did arrest a group of Jewish peddlers and they tortured them and they confessed to the crime. But a long time after that it was realised, it was proved that they could not have committed this crime. So the whole thing was obviously sordidly bogus. What you have now in Judenstein, there's been a cult to Andreas of Rinn for quite a long time. And the bishops did their best to try and dampen this down and to outlaw it. without success. And I don't know whether it's still going. It's still there's this ongoing devotion to this figure. And what you have now is a plaque which has been put up only since the mid-90s, giving the true story, saying that this child was not a martyr in the Christian sense of giving his life for the Christian faith, but he is now a symbol of all children who've been mistreated and abused. So they tried to turn this devotion round. And there is a painting in the church of Christ with the children and a man throwing himself into the water with a millstone around his neck. So that passage, yeah, it is better for a man to put a millstone around his neck rather than harm these little ones. So there is a picture on the church. Could I find this anywhere on the net? No. And I've got loads and loads of stuff about blood libel and this. And if you think the blood libel stuff is out of date, it's still up there. You don't need to go very far to find people who still think, well, no smoke without fire, you know. There must have been some instances of this stuff going on. So, that's there. An example there of, if you like, popular or grassroots religiosity that cannot simply be affirmed, but needed to be challenged and needed to be reshaped. And just to kind of nail the point even further, there's a Jesuit who needs to be much better known, Friedrich Spee, 1591 to 1635, lived during the period of the 30 Years' War, best known for the ministry that he gave towards people who had been accused of witchcraft and were being taken to execution. And over 20 years or so, I think he escorted something like 200, mainly women, to their deaths, became convinced of their innocence, and wrote a book, Causio Criminalis, challenging that. The book was published anonymously, so he's a bit of a whistleblower. Got into trouble, everyone knew who'd written it, but he was protected by his provincial. But once again, grassroots, popular religiosity, if you like, that cannot simply be affirmed, had to be challenged and turned around in some way. So those warning bells are being kind of rung once again there. And I won't dwell on the kind of methods that I want to kind of put forward here. The call for discernment was something that came up quite strongly in the Pentecostalist conference. Recognition of the ways in which Catholicism in particular can be enriched and enhanced by Pentecostalist traditions, by making room for the Spirit. And on the other hand, Catholicism has traditions of discernment which can enable us to purify or sift some of those traditions. And we had a lot of horror stories about charlatans across the globe, from parts of Africa, particularly hair-raising stories from Haiti and places like that. There's an awful lot of charlatanry going on, and need for discernment, the need for criteria for assessing what's bogus and what is genuinely of the Spirit. That's the New Testament imperative, test the spirits, this is St. Paul, and traditions like the Jesuit nation spirituality can provide some of those kind of criteria. We need a way of engaging with culture that isn't simply cultural romanticism, nor is it cultural vandalism. The church seems to veer between the two. We're either affirming a culture in a very uncritical kind of way, or else we're demolishing it. And we need to find ways of culture and the gospel in a mutual kind of dialogue. Questions being raised about models of enculturation. How do we do that in a way that is authentic to both? From dialectic to drama, all the D words. The word dialectic here is basically flagging up the idea that we need a way of talking about conflict and conflictual engagement that is richer and freer than models from the past, whether that's kind of the kind of implications from Hegelian or Marxist style thinking, where we're kind of locked into patterns of interaction which don't acknowledge the richness and the freedom of human agency and also God's agency. The idea that the drama actually carries that better is one of the things that none of the authors that I've been talking about tried to flag up. A theology of encounter, such as we find in the Sunborn. Theology of encounter, such as we find in the Tunkunakri. I would mention the work of the Innsbruck theologians, who are offering a version of dramatic theology, which is finessing Balthasar's to some extent, trying to address some of those rather pathological elements, frankly, that we find in Balthasar's work. Using the work of René Girard to recognise the dynamics of competition and violence that are also very much a part of what we're looking at. Girard looks on the dark side, if you like, of human interactions, and that needs to be brought in a little bit more centrally. So the work of Raimund Schwager, no longer alive, Jesuit based in Innsbruck, seeks to bring together Balthasar's idea of the theodrama and then uses René Girard's anthropology to try and produce a powerful theological tool that can enable us to deal with the kind of pluralities of the encounters that we've been discussing today. As yet, that hasn't been done on a global level, and that's partly what my project is about, to see whether this particular theodrama that's been conceived in Central Europe can actually be used, can actually shed light on what's happening in other parts of the world. I'm going to leave it there because I think there are other things I could have gone on to talk about, particularly within the exercises and resources within the exercise of Ignatius that can be very, very important here. And I'm afraid what I'd like to see, I'd like to have a bit of time for questions, so I'll kind of just pause there to see whether there are any points or suggestions or improvements that can be offered. Sophia, just draw halt at this point? Yeah? Okay, right, yes, sorry.
There's one part of this where you were talking about an intersection of Christology and
Pneumatology. Sorry, Christology and?
Christology and Pentecost or something like that?
Pneumatology, yeah, we love these words, don't we? Christ and the Spirit. The fact that we haven't thought about the Spirit enough as theologians.
About the
third person of the Trinity.
Okay, yeah, okay.
And that's, again, I'm echoing back some of the things that were present in the conference that we had here a few weeks ago, where it's an unsettling reality. By definition, we don't always know what the Spirit is up to. The Spirit isn't doing exactly what we think he or she should be doing. We're doing something else. So discerning that is clearly part of the issue. And if we don't do that, if we separate Christ from the Spirit, then we get a distorted theology.
So is this coming together more after 1965 or even more recently, that author that you were?
Well, I would see that as one of the messages of the growth of Pentecostal Christianity and the Pentecostalist traditions in the church. I think that is a sign of precisely that kind of development.
So it doesn't go all the way back to the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius.
Oh no, not everything.
This is newer, something newer that's evolved that helps us with understanding our faith.
It's a sign of the times.
Yes.
Yeah, and there's a lot of discussion now as to what is genuinely new and what's there from previous and so on. Are we talking about something like a real break, a rupture in what went before, or are we talking about continuities? And those
Something
debates
that was always there, but we haven't articulated it, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, well, Pentecost happened obviously a long time ago, and,
yes.
but we forget things, and I think one of the strong criticisms about, if you like, Western theology or Western Christianity is that it forgot that the Christian God is Trinitarian, and that's not an accidental bit of our belief. It's crucial to understanding God fully. That God is not simply the God who sets everything going, as in the kind of rationalist, deist version, but
The deist?
the notion of God as distant, apart from his creation. He sets creation going, but really has no interaction with it other than that. And that became very popular at the Enlightenment, because it seemed a tidier version of God than anything to do with spirit or the nice mountain of Nazareth, all these things. It seemed a tidier version of God, but it's not helped us. It's not helped us as Christians to live our lives fully and authentically as a part of God's activity in the world. So we're recovering that, hopefully. If we're open to, well, we are being summoned, we're being invited to recover that. Maybe just got 30 seconds more just to kind of fill in on something that I think comes out of the exercises, and something I'm very kind of left to the end and therefore it got missed out. But I think, because it follows on to this point about the Trinity, there's two bits of the spiritual exercises that are really very significant. Well, the whole thing. At the beginning, Ignatius has a meditation called the First Principle and Foundation. And it says, human beings are here to praise, reverence, and serve God, and by these means to save our souls. Well, that will ring bells with some people, you know. Who made me?
God made you.
Why did God make me?
To know him, serve him on this earth, and be with him in heaven.
Well done, exactly. Well, Ignatius has his version of that. Ignatius has his version of that right at the beginning of the exercise. We're here to praise, reverence, and serve God, and by these means to save our soul. And it's a very blunt, bare statement of what we're doing on this planet. Towards the end of the exercises, he has this mystical description of God working for us. God sustains us, making things grow, plants grow, giving life. God sharing himself like a lover. God making a temple of himself in us, making us a temple for himself by dwelling within us. God working, sharing, indwelling. And he doesn't mention the Trinity of that, but it's a kind of love song. It's a description of God soaking the world like the water from a fountain. And it's the mystical high point of the exercises, and it's the nearest you get to a kind of erotic vision that you get in some of the other mystical traditions. This is God's embracing us in his love. And it's where you get this phrase of finding God in all things and all things in God. And it's the same point from the beginning of the exercise, fleshed out in a much more joyful way. And it's holding the two together. That basically you can enjoy the world, you can soak yourself in the world, you can trust the world and all that it has to offer, because you have this orientation, you have this anchor. And there's something there about Jesuits getting that right sometimes, not always, but when we do get that right, it's a very powerful combination of insights. And I think it's one of the things that we need to learn to try and do. We've done it in terms of European culture in many ways. Can we find more global expressions of that? I kind of wanted to finish on that because it's a bit of a high note, but
Yes.
definitely finished at this point. So.
Okay,
Thank you very much.